The wind rolled over the open plains like it had somewhere to be. Dust lifted off the ground in slow spirals, brushing against the brittle stalks of old grass that bent without complaint. Down the long, rutted trail that led to the house, a girl came walking, not hurried, not limping, but steady, as if each step had already been weighed before it touched the ground. She was young, maybe 20 at most, with long black hair braided tight, though loose strands clung to her damp cheeks. Her face bore the stillness of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness. She wore a wool shawl, tattered at the hem, and held tight at her chest a small tin of salt wrapped in cloth. A hunting knife was tied at her belt, but not as threat, more like a memory of needing it. The ranch ahead of her looked half asleep, its roof sagging near the back, one shutter hanging crooked like a tired eye. A single curl of smoke twisted from the chimney, barely rising before the wind scattered it. There was no dog, no welcome, just the sound of the wind skimming the dirt. She didn't knock right away. Her fingers hovered near the doorframe, brushing. A nail scratch in the wood. Then she touched the rusted horseshoe nailed above, and finally rapped her knuckles once, quiet. Then again, louder. The door opened. Samuel Carrick stood there, boots planted square, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, hands calloused and still. His beard was graying, the lines around his eyes cut deep from years of sun and silence. He looked at her, then past her, as if waiting for someone else to step forward. No one did. "You're the one the preacher sent?" he asked. His voice sounded like it came from beneath years of quiet. She nodded once. "Yes, sir." He glanced to the open land behind her, then stepped aside. "Well, come in then." She crossed the threshold like someone entering a church, careful, reverent, unsure if she belonged. Inside smelled of coffee dregs, old wood, smoke, and something like horses and potatoes. The floor creaked as she moved, but not from rot, just age. Everything about the house seemed to carry weight. A rifle leaned against the wall near a rocking chair. The fire in the hearth burned low. He didn't say anything as he walked ahead, nor did she ask questions. He pointed to a small room near. The pantry, cold and spare. A narrow cot, a tin basin, and a window that wouldn't quite shut. "That'll be yours," he said. "Wash up when you can. Mornings start early." She nodded again. He turned and left. Later, she struggled with the fire in the little iron stove, her fingers clumsy with matches and kindling. The room smelled like cold iron and old apples. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls, whispering in a voice too ancient. To name Dot at supper, they sat at the rough kitchen table, him at one end, her at the far side. He said grace without much feeling, and they ate stew in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the ticking of the clock above the stove. She noticed the way he glanced at the empty seat beside him, just once before bowing his head again to eat. He noticed the way she watched the fire, not for warmth, but like someone remembering a fire that got out of control. After the dishes were cleaned and dried, she retreated to her room. She wrapped her shawl tighter and lay down on the cot, her fingers curled around the handle of the knife beneath her pillow. Not out of fear, just old habit. In the other room, Samuel sat in his rocking chair, boots still on, rifle across his lap like a quiet promise. He watched the flames bend and crackle in the hearth, each flicker carving shadows into the hollow places of the room. Neither of them slept easily that night. The wind didn't stop until dawn. The days settled into a rhythm, though neither of them would have called it peace. Morning came with the sound of the rooster and the wind scraping along the siding. Anna rose before light, tying her braid tight, her fingers moving with practice. Memory. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She milked the cow, gathered eggs with quiet precision, swept the porch, boiled water, cleaned tools. Everything she did was orderly, efficient, and wrapped in silence, like she'd learned to make herself disappear even while moving. Samuel noticed it, not in the way a man notices a woman, but in the way a man senses something familiar in. Another wounded thing. Her steps were soft, careful. She closed doors without sound. But when a rider passed too fast on the road, or when he slammed the woodshed latch by accident, she flinched, just slightly. Her shoulders would stiffen. Her eyes flicked toward the sound like a caged bird, waiting for the next hand to strike. He said nothing. He never asked about where she came from. And she never asked about the framed tintype that sat crooked on the mantel. A woman with calm eyes and a crooked smile, dressed in lace with one hand resting on Samuel's shoulder. The glass was cracked down the middle. Late one afternoon, after she'd swept the attic steps, Anna found a chest pushed against the far wall, half covered in a quilt eaten at the corners by mice. She pulled the cover back and opened the lid. Inside were bundles of folded muslin, a dried sprig of heather, buttons still looped on string, a small glass perfume bottle empty, but still faintly floral. Beneath them, wrapped in brown paper, was a wedding dress, yellowed with time, sleeves puffed in a style gone out of fashion. She didn't take it out. She just sat there, cross-legged on the attic floor, looking at it. Samuel found her that way when he came up looking for nails. He stood in the doorway, saw her still form, her dark braid hanging over her shoulder. The light from the attic window cut across her face and fell on the dress like moonlight on old snow. She looked up, startled. He didn't speak, just stared for a moment, his mouth tight, his hand white around the rail dot. Then he turned and left without a word. That night, supper was even quieter than usual. The stew boiled too long. The potatoes were stiff, but neither commented. Outside, the sun sank behind the hills, leaving the land dusted in silver. Samuel went to the barn, spent longer than usual rubbing down the horses. When he came back in, the lamp had been lit, the fire was low, and Anna was sitting on the floor near the hearth, humming. It was a slow, mournful tune, not sad exactly, but ancient. The kind of song that might have been sung to a baby or over a grave. Words in. Her native tongue drifted through the room like smoke, soft, undecipherable. She didn't notice him listening. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, staring at the way her shadow danced across the floorboards. The song ended. The fire popped once. She looked back at him, only briefly, and then went to rinse the pot. He sat in his rocking chair after. She disappeared into her room. The rifle was still within reach. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked into the fire and saw things he didn't want to see. A barn engulfed in flames, the beams cracking one by one like gunshots. His wife's voice, distant, screaming his name through smoke. The smell of burning. Hay, of scorched wool, the taste of failure. He hadn't been there when it started. A trip into town for feed. He got back too late. The land never forgave easily, and neither had he. He hadn't opened that sewing chest in 10 years. He couldn't bear to, but he hadn't thrown it out either. Just let it rot gently beneath the dust, like so many other things. Now here was this girl, not his blood, not his people, not even someone he'd chosen, just someone sent by a preacher with soft eyes and a guilt-ridden voice. But she moved through the house like she belonged to its sorrow, as if she too knew how to survive rooms that had forgotten how to hold joy. He wondered what burned in her past, what loss had carved her so quiet. But he didn't ask Dot, and she never offered. The sky had been brooding since morning, but by late afternoon it finally spoke, not in thunder yet, but in that strange pressure before it breaks. The air turned thick and metallic, the kind of weight that makes a man glance over his shoulder, without knowing why. Clouds gathered like cattle spooked by scent. In the fields, the wind picked up speed, tossing dry brush across the fences. The smell of copper and dust filled the air, sharp as flint. Anna was in the garden, kneeling in the black soil, tucking what few surviving carrot shoots she had left beneath a layer of mulch. She wore Samuel's old shirt, sleeves rolled high, hair braided back tight, her shawl pinned beneath her knees to keep from blowing away. When the hoofbeats came, she paused, dirt clinging to her hands, and looked up. A man on a black horse trotted down the path, saddle slick from sweat, hat low, boots shiny enough to not belong to the land. He didn't dismount, just halted. At the edge of the fence, resting his weight to one side, reins slack in one hand. "Well now," he said, voice too familiar. Didn't think Carrick was the type to take in house girls. Anna stood slowly. Samuel came out from the barn with a length of rope still in his hand. His eyes locked on the rider. "Halbridge," he said flatly. The trader tipped his hat like he was greeting an old friend. "Didn't expect to see that face. Or that little bird in your garden." His gaze returned to Anna. "She one of the ones that used to camp by the East Ridge? Thought most of 'em were gone by now." "She's not yours to talk about." Samuel said. Halbridge smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just curious. You always said you liked stew. Thought maybe you'd share." His eyes narrowed. "How much for her?" Anna didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. Samuel didn't answer either. He just coiled the rope in his hands once, twice, and turned back toward the barn. "Suit yourself," Halbridge said, spitting to the side. "Storm's comin'. Hope you got more inside than silence and her damn soup." The trader turned his horse and rode off, kicking up dirt with his heels. Anna watched until the dust settled. By dusk, the storm hit. It came hard, sudden, wind tearing through the branches, lightning cracking white veins across the black belly of the sky. The rain came not in drops, but in fists, slamming the roof with fury. Samuel lit a lantern and set it on the table. The fire in the hearth hissed where the wind whistled down the chimney. They ate in silence again, though neither touched much. Food. Then a knock, no, a pound, came at the door. Anna's spoon clattered in her bowl. Samuel stood. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He reached for the rifle by the rocking chair and stepped to the door. "Let me in." Halbridge's voice slurred through the storm. "Ain't no sense leaving a man out in this. You owe me." Samuel didn't answer. The pounding continued, louder now, fists or boots or both. Inside, Anna backed toward the corner of the room, hand on her knife. Her face was tight, unreadable, but her eyes were wide with something older than fear. "I said let me in." The voice bellowed again, closer now to rage than desperation. Samuel threw the bolt on the door and swung it open, rifle in hand. Barrel low but steady. Halbridge stood soaked through, face red with drink and cold, a pistol holstered but untied at his hip. He took one step forward. Samuel lifted the rifle, not shaking, not shouting, just lifting. One movement. One choice. Halbridge stopped. They stared at each other for a breath that stretched thin as glass. Then Halbridge sneered. "You always were a stubborn bastard." He turned and trudged back through the rain, boots sinking into mud. Samuel shut the door and bolted it again. The storm raged. Later, long after the thunder stopped shouting and began to grumble low, like an old dog in the distance, Anna stepped out of her room. She had wrapped herself in the old shawl again. Her bare feet made no sound. Samuel sat at the table, lantern burning low, steam rising from the pot. He poured her a tin cup of coffee, black and bitter. She took it without a word and sat across from him. Her braid was damp where it had unraveled. She said thank you, quiet but clear. Then she spoke again, in her language, soft syllables that curved like the wind through pine trees. He didn't ask what it meant, but the way she placed the tin cup back on the table, carefully, evenly, handle turned toward him, felt like something more permanent than a thank you, like something placed in trust. They sat that way for a while. Outside, the storm softened into rain. The fire crackled. Inside the cabin, for the first time, the silence didn't feel like distance, it felt like shelter. The days grew longer without anyone noticing. The land softened under spring's quiet approach, not in wildflowers or songbirds, but in the way frost no longer kissed the water buckets at dawn. The wind still whispered across the open land, but its breath had changed. The cold no longer bit, just nudged. Anna began rising earlier than usual. Samuel heard her once before sunrise, barefoot on the porch, stepping light across the creaking boards. She'd taken to setting out shallow. Bowls of cracked corn just beyond the fence line, near the line of junipers at the edge of the woods. It was where she sometimes stared for too long, as if waiting for something that hadn't come yet. He didn't ask her why she did it. Years ago, he might have chased off whatever came to eat that corn. Wolves, coyotes, wild turkeys. But now, he just watched from the window, sipping coffee, the rifle untouched behind the door. Inside the house, their silences had grown less sharp. They still didn't talk much, but when they passed in the hall, they didn't flinch. She folded his shirts. He replaced the shutter hinges so the wind wouldn't wake her. Neither of them said thank you out loud, but the words lived quietly. In the way they moved around each other, then came the stew. It was late. The sun had dropped behind the hills, casting the kitchen in that in-between blue. Samuel stepped in from the barn, hands still smelling of horses and leather oil. He didn't expect to find her at the stove, shoulders hunched, wooden spoon in. Hand back to him. The pot bubbled softly, the scent rich with thyme and onion. But she was crying. Not loud, not broken, just silent tears falling one after another. Her shoulders trembled as she stirred. She didn't notice him at first. When she finally turned, her face flushed and wet, he didn't say a word. He didn't ask. He stepped forward, slowly, and took the spoon from her shaking hand. Without looking at her, he stirred the pot. The weight of the silence shifted. Her breath caught. She turned and left the room. The stew burned a little. Later, after he'd cleaned the dishes and banked the fire, he walked out to the barn. It was nearly dark, the stars beginning to blink awake one by one. She was sitting beside the fence post, knees drawn to her chest, hair down around her shoulders like a curtain. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, not searching, just trying to feel small enough to fit into it. He carried a wool shawl in his hand. The old one, his wife's. It still smelled faintly of cedar. He stopped beside her. She didn't move. He held out the shawl without a word. She stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached up and took it, fingers brushing his as she did. She wrapped it around herself and kept looking at the stars. He sat down a few feet away. They didn't speak, but the stillness between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a pause, a space being made for something neither could name. The next morning, Samuel saddled the old mule for the ride into town. She followed him to the gate, coat folded over her arms. Before he mounted, she reached out, brushing the dust from his lapel. Her fingers lingered for a moment, too long on the old brass button, the one that never stayed sewn quite right. He watched her hand, but said nothing. When he came back that evening, there was fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, a new pot of stew simmering. His boots were mended and drying by the hearth. Still, they didn't speak of any of it. The air in the house grew warmer, but their distance remained. Not cruel, not cold, just uncertain, like two animals in the woods, unsure whether to fight or lie beside each other in the grass. Each moment they shared now carried weight. Every glance at the dinner table, every brush of fingers passing a plate, every time he walked in and found her humming softly under her breath. It was no longer about whether they could live in the same space. It was about what might happen if they let that space mean something more. He feared it, she feared it, and yet neither of them turned away. The scent came before the smoke. Samuel was out back tending the horses when the wind shifted, brushing against the nape of his neck like a whisper. He looked up, nostrils flaring. The hills beyond the west fence shimmered under the late sun, but the color of the sky behind them had darkened. Not rain, not storm. Fire. He didn't have to call for her. Anna appeared moments later, barefoot, hair undone, eyes fixed on the same line of smoke rising like a warning into the sky. They didn't speak. There wasn't time. By the time they reached the ridge, the brush had already begun to hiss and crackle, low flames licking through the brittle grass. It wasn't a towering blaze, not yet, but it was fast and hungry. A line of fire advancing, steadily, carried by the dry wind. The kind of fire that tested everything. Samuel took a shovel, handed Anna a rake, and together they carved trenches into the earth, working side by side, sweat soaking their clothes. The heat pressed down from above and rose from below, the smell of burning sage and oak stinging their throats. They didn't yell, didn't panic, just moved, dug, hauled buckets from the trough, beat at flames with soaked burlap. His hands bled, hers blistered. Ash clung to their skin like memory. It was hours before the fire bent, changed course, then died down with the shifting wind. They stood in a smoldering field, breathing heavy, smoke curling into the sky like a prayer half spoken. They didn't win. Not really, but they didn't lose the ranch either. They walked back without speaking, their steps slower now, marked by exhaustion. The sun had dipped low, casting the land in gold and ash. Beside the water trough, they collapsed, not dramatically, just sat down at the same time, like their bodies had agreed they'd given enough. Anna reached into the trough and splashed her face. Samuel did the same. The water turned gray in moments. She looked at his arm then, the right one, where the shirt had torn open during the fire. Beneath the soot and fresh scrapes, an old burn scar curved across his forearm, jagged and pale, against his weathered skin. She reached out and touched it. Just 2 fingers. Lightly. He flinched, barely, but he didn't pull away. Her touch stayed. It was the first time she had touched him with intention. Not passing, not necessity. Just presence. The silence between them deepened, but it didn't feel empty. Later that night, after the fire was tended and the house cleaned of smoke, they sat by the hearth again. She had changed into a clean dress, her hair damp, smelling faintly of pine soap. He had bandaged his knuckles and poured 2 cups of coffee, letting them sit untouched on the table. Anna sat on the floor, near the fire. She pulled her knees up and rested her cheek there, watching the flames dance. Samuel sat in the chair behind her, boots off, body sore. He wasn't sure if it was the fire that made her speak, or the space that followed it. "I had a brother," she said, voice low, steady, younger. "We were taken from our mother when the men came, sold separate. Last I saw of him, he was holding a blue marble in his fist." Samuel said nothing. He didn't move. "They gave me to a trader who kept me for 3 winters, then sold me to a family near Santa Fe who wanted someone to teach their girls how to braid." Her fingers found the hem of her dress, twisted it. "I didn't speak for almost a year, not even to myself, not even in dreams." He watched her in silence. She looked into the fire. "Then I left. I followed the trail back north until my feet bled. I didn't know where else to go. Just away. Still, he said nothing, but he was listening. She knew he was. After a long moment, she asked, without turning, "And you?" His voice came slow, thick. "The barn burned down while I was in town. My wife was feeding the goats. A lantern caught a beam. I should have been there, but I wasn't. By the time I got back, it was too late." He took a breath, long and shaking. Her shawl was still hanging by the door. Smelled like cinnamon and soap. I kept it there for months after. The fire cracked, throwing sparks. I didn't know how to start over, he said, so I didn't. She looked up at him then, her eyes soft but unflinching. They didn't reach for each other. They didn't cry. But in that small room, filled with smoke and silence, something opened between them, slow as spring thaw, quiet as roots growing under earth scorched by flame. They were still themselves, still scarred, still silent, but no longer alone. The preacher came just after sunrise, his horse kicking up dust as it crested the hill. The sound of hooves drew both of them out of their morning routines. Samuel in the barn, Anna by the henhouse, a basket of warm eggs pressed to her hip. She stood straighter when she saw who it was. The old man dismounted slow, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome anymore. He nodded at Samuel, then tipped his hat toward Anna. "There's a place in the east," he said gently. "A school for women run by the church. Good people, roof doesn't leak. Plenty to do, but no more digging trenches or chasing fires." His eyes softened. They'd make room for her. Anna didn't say anything. She looked past him, out toward the open land that stretched for miles like a quiet question. Samuel said even less. He looked at her, not the preacher, his face unreadable. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply nodded once, slow and heavy, then turned back toward the barn without a word. The preacher left before the sun was too high, his promise left hanging in the air like smoke. That night, they ate supper in silence. Not the old silence, the one made of distance and distrust, but a new one, made of wait. Neither slept much. Before dawn, Anna rose. She packed what little she had into a flour sack, the tin of salt, her knife, 2 folded dresses. She left the shawl draped neatly over the bed. Samuel was already up, coffee boiling over the fire. He didn't speak when she entered, just poured 2 cups, placed hers on the table. She didn't drink it. Outside, the frost clung to the porch. Rail. She led the mule out slow, the saddle already cinched. At the gate she mounted, the hem of her dress curling in the wind. The trail east was still shadowed, the sun barely peeking over the ridge. She didn't look back right away. She kept her eyes on the road, hands light on the reins. But when she reached the turn in the path, where the old pine leaned just far enough to mark the split between here and elsewhere, she paused. The house was still visible. The porch, the chair, the steaming mug Samuel had left by the door. She stared for a long minute. Then she turned the mule around. Back at the cabin, Samuel was splitting wood. The axe thudded into the stump rhythm, steady, as if his body moved on memory alone. He didn't look up when he heard the hoofbeats, didn't stop when she dismounted. Only when her shadow crossed his boots did he pause. Anna stepped forward and reached out, not to touch him, but to take the axe. Her hands closed around the handle. His loosened. She set the axe gently on the stump. Neither of them spoke. She turned, went to the porch, and began to unpack. He stood there a while, watching the empty space where the weight in his hands had been. Then he followed. Inside, she moved through the room like she had never left. She placed her things neatly in the small chest near the pantry. She smoothed the blanket on her cot. She lit the stove. When he returned to the kitchen, she was braiding her hair. The same hair she had worn loose that first morning. He sat down. The chair creaked under his weight. The rocking chair answered, its rhythm matching the wind that rustled the eaves. She sat too, across from him, the firelight drawing soft gold. Across the walls. Her eyes caught his, steady and unafraid. They didn't touch, didn't name it. But the space between them held something alive. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a home.